Global Governance Futures is brought to you from the Global Governance Institute at University College London. This is a podcast about the challenges facing humanity and possible global responses. How does the world hang together? What has gone wrong? And what has global governance got to do with it? To learn more, please visit ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.
Kathryn Sikkink is one of the scholars who has done most to pioneer the social scientific study of human rights and global accountability. In this episode, we are joined by Kathryn to take a longer view of where the Human Rights Project stands today. Drawing on her early experiences in Latin America and decades of research, she challenges familiar stories of rise and decline. We discuss how advocacy networks and courts have shaped accountability, why gender-based violence was addressed so late, and what careful empirical work reveals about progress alongside backlash. We also reflect on how the way we see human rights politics can shape and sometimes distort our sense of progress or decline. The conversation closes with a defense of hope grounded in evidence rather than idealism.
We start in the world we're in. We recognize that there's manifest injustice all over this world. And we focus on the kinds of manifest injustice that we care about, and we look at how we move from more manifest injustice to less manifest injustice.
This is Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. Kathryn Sikkink is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Her work has been foundational to the study of human rights politics, transnational advocacy networks, and global accountability. We spoke to her in December 2025. Well, welcome, Kathryn, to the podcast. We're really thrilled to have you with us. We've been looking forward to this conversation. There is so much to talk about. I mean, you've been at the forefront of human rights and global accountability scholarship for, pushing on for maybe 3-4 decades even. So there are many directions we could take this in, but that is a good problem to have, I'd say. I mean, your work really has been at the forefront of how we understand norm change in international politics, questions of transitional justice, the justice cascade through the 1990s and on into the 2000s. Of course, some very influential models that human rights scholars have been using for decades, including the spiral model, and a very spirited defense of empirically grounded hope in your 2017 book, Evidence for Hope. So perhaps a larger thread for our discussion today also is how do we make sense of human rights progress and backlash, and what does it mean to think about accountability, to think about activism in, 2025. But before we get into all of that, we do like to begin by inviting our guests to cast their minds back and to share something of their formative influences and how their intellectual journey began. And I was reading a very interesting interview you gave. You described your year as a 20-year-old exchange student in Montevideo in Uruguay as, quote, a transformative experience that made you forever concerned about what you might call the human rights puzzle. So I was wondering whether you could take us back to that moment. I mean, what did it mean to witness a democracy descend into dictatorship, described at the time as the torture chamber of Latin America? And how did that experience shape the kinds of questions that have continued to animate your career?
Well, first, thank you, Tom. Thank you to the students who are here. It's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you this morning. Yes, my experience in Uruguay, I already spoke some Spanish. I wanted to go study abroad. I had this opportunity to apply for a very unique scholarship to study in Uruguay. It was supposed to be an exchange for student leaders, but by the time I got there, Uruguay was 1976 was the worst year of the dictatorship. There was a huge number of, in particular, people imprisoned and tortured. And so the puzzle I spoke of was that Uruguay had been a vibrant democracy almost since the beginning of the 20th century, had been just briefly interrupted for a short period of authoritarianism in mid-century, but otherwise, this vibrant participatory democracy for a Latin American country. It had a large middle class, high levels of education. Um, and so, the puzzle is, of course, how did this country descend into this terrible dictatorship? And parts of that had to do with problems of there was an armed insurgent group, the Tupamaros. Uh, Part of it had to do with problems of the economy, which had been stagnated really since the 1960s. And part of it had to do with the role of the United States that had, at that time, was not supporting democracy and indeed was, how can I say, there was involvement of the U.S. government, especially via the CIA, that really facilitated authoritarianism. Okay. The role in Uruguay was not as direct as it was, let's say, in Chile or in Brazil, where there was direct support for the coup. But the the contributions to undermining norms of democracy and human rights on the behalf of the U.S. government were clear.
And were human rights on your radar at that time? You know, Samuel Moyn famously has argued that human rights really only became a priority in foreign policy during the tenure of Jimmy Carter as president. And there is this sense that prior to that moment, human rights were really relegated as a more domestic concern. Of course, during the 1970s, you had Tom Farrar at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and that important visit they made to Buenos Aires. I don't believe they visited Montevideo, though, during that period. But I'll be curious, what was your engagement with the human rights frameworks, the human rights NGOs, such as Amnesty, the very early pioneers of the human rights agenda during that era?
Right. So you're correct. Amnesty International already existed. And in fact, Amnesty was the organization that had documented the extraordinary use of torture in Uruguay. I arrived in March 1976. The Carter campaign was underway. Okay. And what I discovered was that Uruguayans it was impossible for them to talk in public about to critique their own government. You risked being imprisoned. So, but they were very lively in their discussion of the U.S. presidential campaign, and everyone I met was 100% behind Jimmy Carter. Now, at that point, I had some questions about Carter. I wasn't persuaded yet, but and they were behind him because he was starting to talk about human rights. So it wasn't that Jimmy Carter taught the Uruguayans about human rights. Let me be very clear about that. Uruguay had, prior to the coup in 1973, Uruguay had already ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and Uruguay had accepted the first optional protocol to that. I know there's some lawyers in this group. The first optional protocol that permitted individual petition of Uruguayan citizens to the Human Rights Committee, which was the treaty body that oversaw the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So let's give you an idea. 73, Latin America, Uruguay knows these conventions, participated in helping draft these conventions back in the 1960s, ratifies early, accepts this very strong form of supervision from the international system, something the United States has never agreed to. Okay. And so later on, I learned a lot about Uruguay's role in 1945, drafting the UN Charter to make sure that human rights were included in the UN Charter at the San Francisco conference where the charter was drafted. Okay. Once again, Uruguay and Latin American countries were lobbying to get language on human rights in the charter. The United States and the great powers were opposing it because the charter was, of course, strong, hard law. And they did not want their human rights obligations bound by hard law. There were 20 Latin American countries of the 50 countries present in San Francisco. They were there at that time. And it was their lobby, together with the lobby of U.S. NGOs and civil society organizations present in San Francisco, that led to the fact that the UN Charter mentions human rights 7 times, and it calls for the creation of a human rights commission. Okay, so I'm sorry, I've had this impression. I'm not going to say it again. I think that Samuel Moynes Samuel Moynes is a historian of intellectual history, mainly of Europe. Okay, and he's I think a very brilliant historian of intellectual history, mainly of Europe. But he shouldn't try to make broad proclamations about the whole world, including the third world and including Latin America, which is a topic he does not know well. And he did a disservice to the scholarship on human rights to detract us for so long in a conversation that wasn't hardly worth having, and that is human rights are created in the 1970s. I mean, it's simply, I feel, was a distraction for years instead of getting down to, I think, more careful and detailed, empirically driven and historically guided human rights from scholars from all over the world, including the developing world.
Yeah, I actually cut my teeth on human rights in Latin America myself while working on Defensores del Pueblo or human rights ombudsman. So I'm very familiar with the region and the history there. And also within UN structures, if you read Theo van Boven's accounts of the human rights situation, obviously it was highly contested and very challenging. And I also I recall Ian Guest's famous book Behind the Disappearances. But obviously, this was a politics that was underway
Yeah,
within the UN structures, however contested and
yeah.
distorted.
Can I just make one additional remark since we're on Uruguay? So, because the Uruguayan democratic government in 73 had ratified the additional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, all of the first cases before the Human Rights Committee, there's a whole series of important Uruguay cases before the Human Rights Committee early on. And you're going like, why Uruguay? At the same time, there were all these other problems in Latin America, Chile, Argentina. Why all the cases on Uruguay? And again, the lawyers in this group will appreciate because Uruguay had accepted the compulsory jurisdiction. So individual Uruguayans who had suffered repression were able to bring cases before the Human Rights Committee at a time when the committee was still very young in terms of the ICCPR just entered into effect in 1976, right? And so these early cases gave the Human Rights Committee the ability to start acting, and they were Uruguayan cases because Uruguay had ratified, not because the Carter administration had done anything to the committee, because Uruguay had accepted obligations under that convention. Now, so again, my students were happy to talk with Jimmy Carter, and we're very supportive. And Jimmy Carter made a fantastic impact on U.S. human rights policy. Okay, and as we see with President Trump today, U.S. presidents do have a bully pulpit, and so Jimmy Carter used that bully pulpit to promote human rights in the world. Okay, now and I admire that and I recognize it. That's very different from saying it would never have occurred to people in Latin America to think of human rights if Jimmy Carter hadn't told them. That is just factually untrue and does a huge disservice to people in the region.
So, of course, Latin America is also very famous for sort of classic examples of transitional justice from authoritarian regimes to fragile democracies through the late 1980s into the 90s. And we wanted to discuss that. But just before we turn to that question, I would like to ask about your return to the US from Uruguay. You returned to Columbia University, is that right, in the late 1970s to pursue further studies, and you received your PhD at Columbia in 1984, I believe. But I was curious to ask, how was it coming back to the US and wanting to pursue research in human rights? Was it within a political science department, within the political science paradigms of the times, and also as a woman, one of the really pioneering scholars in this space?
Yeah.
I'd be curious to just get your reflections on that time.
Right. Well, first, you've missed a little parenthesis of my career. When I finished my undergraduate degree, I applied for and received a year-long paid fellowship financed by the Ford Foundation that placed me at a small human rights organization in Washington, D.C., called the Washington Office on Latin America. And they saw my experience in Uruguay. I arrived in I arrived in 1979. They put me immediately in charge of the work on behalf, there I was, a 24-year-old, immediately in charge of their work on behalf of Uruguay and Argentina. And we were very much an advocacy, but also a service group. Human rights organizations arrived from Latin America because they wanted to visit the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which was based in Washington, D.C. They wanted to lobby the U.S. Congress on behalf of human rights, sometimes just to get support to try to have people released from prison. Um, and so I spent almost 2 years working there. The first year as an intern, the second year, and they asked me to stay on a staff, and met many so the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, the grandmas of Plaza de Mayo, the people from these rights organizations came to Washington. I met them. We were a service organization. I made appointments for them. I went with them and translated. But I learned so much from watching these activists in action. But at a certain point, I discovered that I was more interested. People would say, we got to lobby this bill through Congress to cut off economic aid to human rights abusers, right? And I said, do we know if cutting off economic aid to human rights abusers actually is effective in improving human rights? There was a prior bill which was cutting off U.S. military aid to human rights regimes. And that struck me as the link was so straightforward that struck me as a valuable thing. But economic aid was much more complicated, as you people can imagine, right? And I would sort of say, I would like to know more about that. And they said, we don't have time for research. We need to get down to our advocacy. And at that point, I had the opportunity. I applied. I started my PhD at Columbia University. I was very happy to be back in the realm of ideas where I could ask and try to answer those questions. But I was forever marked by that episode of advocacy. I kept in contact with people over the years. I went back to interview them for my research. So I just wanted to say that. But what did I find at Columbia University? I found brilliant scholars who were teaching international relations, and no one ever mentioned NGOs. No one ever mentioned civil society. No one ever mentioned human rights, for that matter. And so I just felt there was this huge disjuncture between a world I had just lived in and worked in Washington, D.C., where it was not just NGOs, but Congress was interested. The presidency was interested. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights was doing fantastic work. And I was like going, where is all this? It was not taught in an excellent political science department at Columbia University. So quite a few years later, that was partly the reason for the book I co-authored with Margaret Keck called Activists Beyond Borders. It was not directed at the activists who knew exactly what they were doing. It was directed at the political scientists who had failed to study this important role of civil society in global politics, in global governance, the topic of this class.
Hi, so I'm gonna come in here. On coming on from your talking about your work on advocacy, justice, etc. I'm quite interested in global gender and LGBTQ plus human rights advocacy and governance work. So I've been having a look for a recent article of yours on global trends of transitional justice and gender. And I'm aware that this is part of or relates to your current work co-leading the transnational justice evaluation tools comparative project, analyzing transitional justice, global accountability trends, truth commissions, and reparations. So before I get into a more gender specific question, I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about this project as a whole, and what you thought the most important findings of the project were.
Okay. So first, Charlie, thanks so much for that question. That's my most recent research, and I'm really excited to talk about it. But just because we've been on this kind of historical moment, I'm going to begin by just taking you back a little bit in my own intellectual history, and that is this book I just mentioned, Activists Beyond Borders, published in 1998, had three big empirical chapters. One of them was about kind of the classic human rights network. One of them was about environmental networks. That was my co-author, Margaret Keck, was an expert in environmental NGO networks. And the third one was a chapter on the global movement on violence against women. Okay. And that's what it was called back when I was doing the research in the early 1990s. Okay. And so I wrote a whole, and the discussion I had was really, this was an issue that was not on the global agenda, and that women activists put it on the global agenda. Okay. And my evidence for being not on the global agenda was that the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Convention, had been drafted and opened for signature in 1980. And it was about all forms of discrimination against women. It did not mention violence. It did not mention any sexual violence, any rape. And so you realize it was not on the global agenda. Women's rights were, violence, gender violence was not. Okay. And so it was, how did that happen? How did sexual violence and gender get on the agenda? And so I have a chapter there that was about how that happened. Okay. And so I had an early interest in this theme and the role of civil society groups in really getting issues on the agenda. Okay. So fast forward to my 2017 book, which was my first book on transitional justice, called The Justice Cascade: How Human Rights Prosecutions Are Changing World Politics. Okay. And in those early trials, it was the same issue I discovered back with Activists Beyond Borders. There was not attention to gender violence. Okay. And so we developed this database that my teams actually I've had various teams with support from various foundations, the National Science Foundation, my colleagues at Oxford University, especially Lee Payne, and I worked 6 years with funding to develop the first big database on transitional justice. And more recently, the Canadian government, the Global Affairs Canada, has supported an updating of our data. We found also that from 1970 to 1990, there was not attention to gender in a transitional justice. It's a very interesting question. Why wasn't there? 1990 is pretty late. And then we recoded all of our trial data, our reparations data, and our Truth Commission data to ask whether or not it was gender attentive. By then, we're using not violence against women, we're using the notion of gender attentiveness. By that, we are looking at and gender attentiveness was about gender-based violence, but not only about violence. It was about other forms of gender crimes. And I say crimes because we were looking at prosecutions, individual criminal accountability trials. Okay, so because it was criminal accountability, these needed to be gender crimes. And so we found that there was an upswing starting in the 1990s, finally with attention to gender crimes in transitional justice, something that had been absent before. And that let me ask this question that I always am interested in asking: how'd that happen, right? Why wasn't it there before, and why does it emerge, right? And I had the quantitative data that got me started on the question. I do what I often do, and that is do the combination with some quantitative and qualitative, right? Sometimes the qualitative sends me to the quantitative, and sometimes the quantitative sends me to the qualitative. And so one of the things I went back to Argentina, where I'd done research forever, and I said to scholars there who've been working with victims and been representing victims in the legal system, I said, why? Why wasn't there attention to gender? And it's longer than we can say, but I can say women and women victims, not other victims, women victim gave testimony early on for the trials of the juntas in 85, for the Truth Commission in 83. So there was gender violence was mentioned, but there was a sense that in the early period they stuck with very the most straightforward prosecutions, and that was murder and kidnapping, which was really mass murder and disappearances, mass disappearances. They prosecuted only for that. Then there was an amnesty law that lasted until 2005. And finally, after the amnesty law ended, the victims came forward and said, we now want to talk about gender violence. We testified before. Now we want gender violence to be the crime and rape in particular, the crime that people are prosecuted for. And so I realized that there were various reasons why there wasn't attention to gender, but one reason had to do with the choices that victims themselves were making, but also with the inability of domestic legal systems to be able to frame these charges, to frame charges around gender violence.
Wow, that was great. That was really insightful. And I've actually been having a look at the website as well, like having a play around with the interactive map and stuff. So obviously that what you said really relates. You also mentioned you mentioned well this role of advocacy networks, like these human rights networks, environmental NGO networks, this movement of violence against women. I was wondering, relating that obviously to your early work on um, transnational advocacy networks. I was wondering if you saw their power for the future. Like you mentioned how they had a lot of impact in the 90s, like with progressing, uh, putting gender on like the mainstream of human rights structure. I was wondering if you thought that these TANs and these networks had what do you see them having the same amount of power that they had in the past, given today's like shrinking civil spaces, widespread disinformation, increased digital repressions? Do you perceive them as being as powerful as they once were?
Right. So we were looking for gender crimes more generally, and we found towards the end of the data coding, which goes from 2010 to 2020, we found in particular that LGBTQ plus communities were beginning to weigh in and were beginning to have an impact. Okay. And so while the great bulk of gender attentive trials, reparations, and truth commissions focus on women and focus on sexual violence and especially rape against women, towards the end of the period, we see the beginning of attention to LGBTQ victims. And just to give you one example, one of the trials we coded as a gender attentive one of the trials we coded as a gender attentive trial was a trial of police officers in Ecuador, where they were prosecuted for dereliction of duty. And that was the charge, but it turned out the context was that a trans individual was beaten up on the streets of, and the police officer stood by and did nothing. And so that was a gender attentive trial when they were prosecuted for dereliction of duty. And that's an example of kind of changing consciousness about what is a gender crime and a successful attempts to begin to broaden it out. And so if you'll permit me to just go one step further, and that is, a lot of people, there was a big critique in the transitional justice gender literature that there was only attention to women and only attention to rape. And our data confirms that the most attention was to women and to rape. But there was also a notion that there was a hierarchy of harms, and that if you paid attention to women and rape, then that would crowd out attention to other to men and boys and to LGBTQ communities. So we went and looked at our data, and what we found is that those countries that had early attention to violence against women, including rape, were more likely to be open to attention to gender crimes for other groups, and especially where there was social movement, demand, and pressure. Okay, so we said we don't find evidence of that attention to gender, women and rape crowds out other attention. We find what we call spillover effects. Once you know about gender crimes and the importance of accountability, you're more open to a wider understanding of gender crimes, including LGBT communities and men and boys.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to jump in here to bring up the topic of technology and human rights.
Mhm.
We live in an increasingly interconnected world, and technological innovations are leading the way. Violations are arguably more visible now than they've ever been. And through your research, you have demonstrated that the human rights movement has created what you called a information paradox, where better reporting makes things appear worse, even when the underlying trends are improving, right?
Yeah.
So, would you be able to explain this to some of our listeners who may be part of a more general audience, as well as kind of explain its implication for human rights advocacy?
Great. Thank you, Jackson, for that great question. I want to begin by saying that technology has long played a role. Okay. And I mean, just bear with me 1 minute. Okay. In Activists Beyond Borders, I talk about historical cases, I talk about the anti slavery movement. There's a moment where anti-slavery activists in the United States go to a big conference in London and they say, fast boats. Never before have we been able to have this technology that lets us get together with our colleagues and arrive so quickly. Okay. Much later, the much later, okay, um, the decline in airfares, transatlantic airfares, was crucial for the activists I worked with in that came from Argentina and Uruguay. Ordinary people could take these long flights. The prices came down. The telephone rates, just ordinary people could make phone calls. Amnesty International Chile talked every day to Amnesty International London during the Pinochet regime because the rates were cheap enough they could do it. Okay, so technology change has been there. It's not exactly so new, but obviously it continues at an incredible rate. So I have long believed that we have to be super careful evaluating data because, as I said, and as you said, we now care more and know more than ever before about human rights violations. We have expanded our understanding of what constitutes a human rights violation, and that's all for good. We've expanded to focus on these kind of gender crimes that I just talked about. That's a great advance. Um, but we want to make sure that as we expand, we don't despair by thinking the world has never been such a bad place as it is today. I do not believe that to be the case. Okay. And people, I always say, if that's the case, tell me the golden age you want to return to where you think things were really good. I say, because as a woman, I promise you, I don't want to go back I can't find a period, that I want to go back to. Okay. So, and people sort of go, the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, and all of a sudden everything is good. I'm saying, oh, you mean the 1990s when the genocide in the Balkans happened, when the genocide in Rwanda happened, when the genocide in Darfur happened? You mean that decade? That's the decade you want to go back to. People's memory is very selective about things are terrible now, but things back in 1990 were good, and I lived through it. They weren't good. Okay. So that's one thing is we've got to be really careful with these memory effects. We have the human brain, as I've written about in another very small book called International Norms moral psychology and neuroscience, the human brain has negativity bias in the present. Okay, we pay more attention to negative events, and that had important evolutionary reasons, you know. But we have to guard against negativity bias when we get despairing about thinking things have never been so bad. Okay. And and I just want to give an example. For example, anyone who wants to claim that rape has never been so bad as it is today, it totally doesn't understand when we started gathering information about rape. Okay. Mainly, there's not good information about rape in the world. If you look at a map of rape, there's all these gray places, but the countries aren't even collecting the data. Okay. The places that look like the rape capital of the world are just the places collecting good data. Okay, so the data is incredibly unreliable, and right now we can't talk about whether there's been an increase or decrease of rape. So other data we've been collecting for a longer time, and we have a better sense of things. So that just that people need to be aware of all these phenomena before we think that things are worse today than they ever have been. And I'm not saying things are great today. I'm just saying I've lived through a long enough time to know that this particular moment is not uniquely bad for human rights.
Okay, thanks so much for that. So,
Yeah.
kind of to keep going with this, as you already know, we are global governance students. And one thing that we've learned is how governments are putting newfound interest on global governance as a practice and as a concept more than they ever have before. One such state is China, and China has recently been advancing its alternative vision of global governance that's centered on sovereignty, openness, and development. Yet it's frequently criticized for alleged human rights violations and for restricting information flows. So, how does this sort of information paradox help us interpret this tension? In contexts where censorship suppresses reporting rather than expanding it, does the absence of data, create a distorted impression of human rights performance? And then, like taking this further, how might this shape the perceived legitimacy of this Chinese model of global governance at home and abroad?
Mm-hmm. Great question. Yes, at one point when we were talking about the information paradox, we said the places in the world where we get most concerned are kind of this middle ground of countries that have very big human rights violations and have societies that are open enough. They permit the activity of domestic NGOs that can report on and communicate human rights problems. Okay. And so sometimes, like Brazil often codes quite badly on the human rights score, and I sort of say, Brazil today is great compared to Brazil during the military government. They still have big problems. But the main thing is they've got these active human rights groups that are reporting on all sorts of racial discrimination, racial violence, and gender violence. And we sometimes think things are bad because we're getting really quality reports out of Brazilian civil society groups. Okay. So at a time, you'll get like Brazil, there's a score called the political terror score. And sometimes Brazil will code as bad as, some countries with much more serious, problems. But yes, the Chinas, the Myanmars of the world that completely suppress the activity of domestic human rights organizations are, of course, suppressing information. And so we need to take this information paradox into account and need to know a little bit more about where are places with bad problems but good reporting versus places with really bad problems and no reporting so it's hard to know about.
Hi, Kathryn. Kind of similar to Jackson's question or building off of it. In your forthcoming article, Is the Justice Cascade Over? Accountability in an Era of Impunity, you note that the greatest uncertainty for the future of global justice stems from the emergence of populist opposition in advanced industrial democracies, and that backtracking by the US and some European states threatens to erode the infrastructure that has long supported global justice efforts. This made me think about some of your earlier work, which I was reading with Finmore, where it's discussed that critical states in a norm cascade were typically assumed to be powerful liberal democracies, often the US or other major European countries. As you mentioned, it's also true at the same, oops, sorry, I'm getting like lost in my question. As you mentioned, it's also true that these same states may now be withdrawing from their historical role as norm promoters, which makes it a very different international context than the one embedded in the 1998 model. So then my question is, how does this shift affect our understanding of who can function as a critical state in a global norm cascade? And if the traditional liberal anchors are backtracking, can an authoritarian state such as China, which is increasingly active in promoting alternative governance norms and becoming a critical state for competing cascade possibly? And does the rise of Southern protagonism mean that regions like Latin America or Africa may now be central arenas where rival normative orders are gaining traction?
Yes, great question, Elizabeth. And so, as I just said, and I was talking about both Jimmy Carter as as well as Donald Trump, the president of the United States has incredible power, and that power includes the power to undermine norms as well as to promote norms. So I'm deeply worried about what is happening today in terms of undermining human rights norms. Okay. I also do want to point out that another crucial concept that involves norms but also legitimacy in global governance is that a government cannot create a norm by itself, and a government cannot create legitimacy by itself. Legitimacy is by definition only granted by other actors. Okay. And so one of the things, I think one of the things that happened with Jimmy Carter and, support of human rights is that was already a groundswell of support in the world for human rights. And there were already these treaties ratified, commissions up and working, and so that the US government also lent its support, really contributed to norm cascade there. Okay. And with Donald Trump today, some of the things he's doing, like can he create a norm cascade over, bombing small boats in the Caribbean? My feeling is no, because people, any expert on international law, and they've said it clearly, we've heard it over and over again. No, this is a complete violation of national law. I've talked to my classes, I'm talking to my colleagues. Some people say, is it a war crime? And the first thing they say is no, because it's not a war. And it's nonsense to call this kind of situation a war. So right away, no one's buying the notion that the United States can be at a war with drug smugglers no serious scholar or person who knows about the laws of war. So then we say, well, if it's not a war, what is it? Well, we're in the realm of criminality, of international crime. And in that case, we have procedures. The U.S. Navy and the U.S. Coast Guard, for that matter, as well as every place else, has long known how to stop boats, to confiscate drugs, to arrest individuals and to bring them into port and prosecute them for criminality. It's not like we're helpless about this. It happens every day. The U.S. Coast Guard, during the time that Donald Trump has been ordering the Navy to fire on these boats and kill people, the U.S. Coast Guard brought in 200 individuals into port to be prosecuted for crimes in other parts of the world. Okay, so again, the notion that we're helpless against it is just absurd. So he can try, but he's not going to establish, I think, a norm, except in the most self-interested authoritarian regimes. Okay, now can we create norms just by violent self-interest regimes who are patting one another on the back for things they're interested in? Norms are standards of appropriate behavior. Standards of appropriate behavior, okay? Appropriate, and here you folks are in an ethics class. It means judgments have to be made about what is right and what is wrong. What is right and what is wrong. And authoritarian governments are always trying to convince you that what they're doing is right. But the question is, are they creating belief, genuine belief, or is it just fear? Okay. So I think there's, on that particular case, I think that Trump is not able to create new norms. Let's look at China. Yes, what China in the South China Sea. China wants to argue that this crazy 9.9 line that it has in the South China Sea is the new norm. It's like no one in the South China Sea believes them. When Philippines brought a case against China in the tribunal of the law of the sea about Chinese incursion in their territorial waters or in their exclusive economic zone, the law of the sea tribunal voted unanimously with the Philippines against China. Okay, so once again, we have a great power trying to do like incredible power grab, and maybe they'll get away with it. I don't know. They may get away with it. But is it a norm? Is it legitimate? Is it considered appropriate? No one in the South China Sea thinks so. And so China cannot create legitimacy for itself, and that grab is so it's so extreme. Just pull it up, pull up the visual of the South China Sea and look at the land grab they're trying to make, and how it overlaps with all the territorial seas and all the exclusive economic zones in that area. So I think we need to, of course, we know we should be very, very worried about what these authoritarian rulers are trying to do to change norms. Of course, we should worry. I'm very worried. But we shouldn't assume, just because Donald Trump says it's a norm, or just because that it doesn't work exactly like that. Legitimacy must be granted. Notions of right and wrong must be changed.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. And thank you for just taking the time to really break that down. But, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really compelling. Thank you, Kathryn. I'm going to pick up where you left off there, and perhaps we can frame this conversation both at the sort of the macro scale today, and then we'll move to the micro as well. But this is a podcast on global governance. We are global governance and ethics scholars and students. I include myself among the students. We never stop learning here. Certainly, Michael Zuhn's work on legitimacy and global governance has been quite influential in the scholarship recently, and he's arguing essentially that what we're encountering now in the global political domain, particularly within the multilateral arena, is this contestation over the very basis of legitimation. So I think the examples you gave are fascinating. It's not just the what counts as legitimate, but also now people are asking, well, who decides about this, and also the how. How and under what conditions can we actually institutionalize a legitimate or authoritative response to key concrete concerns that have important ethical implications. So the macro question is, many people regard the human rights enterprise even as in crisis. And indeed, you've been someone who has been very active in those debates. And I'm thinking of, say, Posner's book, The Twilight of Human Rights, and of course, perhaps the more provocative Stephen Hopgood's book, The End Times of Human Rights. It seems your position is that, let's not rehearse these sort of end times narratives. But I'm curious to ask, to what extent do you see a crisis in human rights today? And to what extent, if it is a crisis, is it a manageable disruption within the parameters of the human rights system? Or does it actually speak to something fundamentally problematic around the liberal framing assumptions underlying the human rights project?
Mm-hmm. So first, you're very right to signal, Zern. But I want to say more broadly, the German IR community for doing fantastic research on norm contestation, and global governance. So I want to signal not only Zern, but Nicole Diedelhoff and Zimmerman. Angie Weiner has been doing this for quite a while. Okay, so these are people studying systematically with good data and with very sophisticated theory what's happening with norm contestation, not just right now, but over the last couple of decades. Okay. And so, I don't even talk anymore about Posner and Hopgood. I've said my piece about them. I think it is not high quality research, and we should not waste any more words on it. Okay. But if people want to read high quality research, we should turn to these German scholars who are doing it. Thomas Riese, of course, has been long involved. And they're trying to get a bunch of case studies about important norms. They're trying to measure. They're trying to talk about the results of these, and they're finding some very interesting things. Some of that it suggests, yes, there has been some norm erosion. There's been lots of norm contestation. There has been some degradation and erosion of norms, but in other places, the norms have been sustained despite contestation. There's variation by issue area. Okay, so I just would encourage all of you to kind of I know Tom is familiar with his literature, but I encourage all of you to go to that direction. Secondly, I do want to hear, I know you're an ethics class. I teach some ethics, okay? And the question is, what kind of ethics are, what's your models of ethics? And, you all get the classic deontological versus consequentialism. In my class, I'm teaching actually Amartya Sen's book, Idea of Justice. And we are using Amartya Sen's idea of comparative realization to understand what's trying to happen in the global governance world. Okay. And the dilemma with ethics, and of course, in our ethics classes, we want to talk about our comparisons to the ideal. We have an ideal world. We're always falling short of the ideal world. And that's an important ethical thing we need to continue to do. Here's my ideal. Here's our world. We're so far from my ideal. Okay. But as I say in one of my books, that means we have a measuring tool with only negative numbers on it. We can only say, here's my ideal. Here's the real world is -1, -2, -3, -4. Okay, there's no possibility using that measurement tool for any notions of things staying the same, getting better. Okay. Amartya Sen, and he's an economist and an incredible philosopher, insists on his comparative realization approach. We start in the world we're in. We recognize that there is manifest injustice all over this world. And we focus on the kinds of manifest injustice that we care about, and we look at how we move from more manifest injustice to less manifest injustice. We're not doing what he calls transcendental institutionalism. I think as political scientists, I don't do philosophy. If they want a philosophy class, they want Rawls, you can go to the philosophy department here. We have wonderful philosophers. If you're in my political science IR class, we start in the real world and we say, have things, there's manifest injustice. Can we measure if there's a decline in manifest injustice which corresponds to improvements in justice? Okay. And so I guess that's what I'd say is I think we need to use our ethical tools, but I prefer Sen's ethical tools of comparative realization. And we need to use our best research. So just one more, because I know you're studying ethics. Okay, consequentialism. You have all these philosophers who want to tell you, everything from about what we know about the consequences. Social scientists are the experts. That's what we do. We do consequences. We do consequences with measurement, and so we need to devote ourselves. We're going to do consequentialism. It needs to be empirically based consequentialism. And, enough of these people who want to talk about consequences without data. Okay. And so I think we do that. I think as social scientists, we have an important contribution to make to ethical debates by insisting that we use a more comparative realization approach, but if we're going to talk consequences, we use data.
Totally fascinating, and I can see how we could probably spin off for another hour just on this topic. And of course, UCL is the birthplace of utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham is still in the building, so
Exactly.
so all well taken. And well, the students will be actually studying the global ethics course next term. So lots of good insights and questions to bring in and to challenge my colleagues with, I think, there, Kathryn. So thank you so much for that. I suppose on the more micro level, my research on Defensa del Pueblo, Human Rights Ombudsman, really placed in the foreground the role of individual agency, the role of these grassroots organizations, church groups, NGOs, whoever they may be. And the fact that, although it can often seem like a crisis from the outside, that situation is just the ground upon which they stand most of the time, in that violations are not a deviation from the norm, sadly. They are often the norm, and that there are plenty of people out there getting on with this very difficult, complex, imperfect, sometimes impossible work of trying to square political pragmatism with human rights principle. So, in the introduction to your book, Evidence for Hope, you write that human rights work requires, quote, anger, hope, and the belief that you can make a difference, and that hope must be reasoned, well-informed, patient. So I was curious to ask, how do you personally sustain that balance in a world where activists increasingly do feel, I think, exhausted, often targeted, and of course the sort of the democratic space for activism is under threat, not only in sort of the authoritarian context, but increasingly in a liberal regimes around the world.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Tom, for that. The fact that I work on Latin America, and that's always been my touchstone, has influenced me. Okay, when I went to graduate school in Columbia University, all of Latin America except three countries were authoritarian, and some were brutal authoritarians. Okay, the three countries, and here this is the irony. One was Venezuela. Colombia, which had, of course, ongoing civil war, so a terrible situation, and Costa Rica. And I should have done quantitative methods in graduate school. I didn't do it because I said, I work on Latin America. They're all authoritarian. There's no good data. Why should I study how to analyze bad data? Okay. And so yes, today, with all the problems there are in Latin America and places like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Venezuela, you also saw terrific advances across the region. I go every year to Uruguay. Here's this country that was the torture chamber of the Americas when I got there in 76. Now its democracy scores higher than that of the United States. It has a very dynamic, very democratic, and prosperous society. Okay. And so that does, of course, sort of sustain my hope because I see what happened. Even Argentina, which, there's very big problems today with the government of Milei, but nothing like a return to the massacres and mass violence of the military regime. Okay, nothing near it. They have big disagreements over politics. They're still holding elections. People are still winning elections. We may or may not like them, but as a democratic society, they still have big. And so Chile, likewise, Colombia's war is over. There are no using a normal coding for conflict, there are no major conflicts in Latin America. There were 17 conflicts in Latin America when I started there. Okay. So some of that sustains me, to go and, I mean, seriously, to go and, of course, there are problems in other parts of the world. And I think people who work on other parts of the world, may feel that more deeply. But, again, it's not like China was a paragon of democracy ever. It had a glimmer of hope for a moment, and now that's disappeared. But again, the first part of my professional career was when we had the Soviet Union fully behind the Iron Curtain with intense repression, and China as a deeply repressive society. And so I'm going, nothing new here. There was the momentary hope that Russia might become more democratic. It never did, and it still isn't. And so I do think there's like short memories, or again, kind of focus on the hopes of the post-Cold War period, but not on the long, with global governance. I was just talking to my students, global governance. Okay, everyone thinks in the post-war period, global governance worked, and now it doesn't work. I'm saying, no, the post-war period was the Cold War. The great powers, violated, the norms consistently all the time. All the great powers did. The United States invaded in Latin America, military, covert and overt invasions in Latin America. The Russians, were keeping their republics as satellites with complete force. And so where's this notion that there was a golden period back there that we could just return to? I don't buy it. There was a moment that the third wave of democracy stopped. okay, very dramatic increase in democracy. It leveled off and it's slightly declining numbers of democracy in the world. Okay, democracy is not in free fall. There's no fourth wave, and the remaining cases are tough cases. Okay, it will take all the struggles that people throughout the world made. In Latin America, there was a third wave because there was a first and second wave, and the second wave didn't work, and they all went back to authoritarianism, and now we have a third wave. It's mainly holding. Okay, but the notion that the people of Egypt and Tahrir Square in a single try, we're going to move from completely authoritarian government to new democracy, is going to take the Egyptians a couple of waves too, and the Tunisians and others. Okay, so that's kind of my long-term view about it.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, to close, our podcast is dedicated to imagining imperfect utopias, is what we call it, futures that are principled but realistic. From your vantage point, what kind of human rights architecture is still worth fighting for? If you were to identify one or two levers that could meaningfully shift global governance towards greater dignity and equality, where would you place your hope? And to bring this back to myself, my classmates, and everyday individuals. And this sort of relates to what Tom was asking regarding the politics of hope. But global governance is a huge concept. Human rights is a huge concept. How can we hope to make a difference in these fields, especially when it feels like these concepts, such as a human rights utopia, feels increasingly unreachable?
Well, first, I love the notion of imperfect utopias. Okay. Second, in terms of levers, all my students are handing in papers today in my international law and global justice class. I make them all make proposals for change. They have to make proposals in very specific areas where they learn a lot about the law, about and every paper will be slightly different in terms of the lever, the issue, and the lever that works on that issue. So the first thing I want to say, there's no just one big lever that's going to, you have to go issue by issue. And, they're working on everything from, of course, LGBTQ rights, but, abortion access, underwater cables, regulation of AI. I mean, you name it, we've got everything, but if I were forced to give one lever, I would say that the notion of transnational advocacy networks has often been misunderstood. Some people think, that we meant only civil society organizations. Go back and read the definition. We didn't mean that. It was a set of relevant actors working together, with shared norms and dense exchanges of information. The actors in a transnational advocacy vary, but very often there were states. States were involved. The advocacy network that worked against torture was Amnesty International, and then Denmark and Sweden were leading the way in terms of getting a convention against torture, a declaration against torture, a convention against torture, and really figuring out how to end torture. Okay, and so I think we need transnational advocacy networks made up of diverse actors. Foundations get involved. Who's giving the money for this? States get involved. Sometimes even corporations get involved in bringing about change. It depends on the issue. On trafficking, for example, there was a code developed by some of the hotel associations. It's just that hotels have to start taking some responsibility for trafficking. That's where these people are moving through hotels, right? And so they try to get a code on that. So I just think that the levers are diverse. We need to look at the issue area. We need to look at the stage it's at. Sometimes we need a new treaty. Normally, we can't get new treaties these days. Mainly, my students come to me and say, "We're going to draft a new treaty." I said, "Think again." It's very, very hard to draft new treaties in this thing. But some cases, right, there's a treaty moving ahead on crimes against humanity. It's been drafted. And, you've got to figure how we're going to pry that one out. It's almost drafted and somehow it's blocked. That treaty should move forward. It'd be an important device. So learn, I know each one of you and the issues that you work on have a sense for who the actors might be that are going to take leadership. Civil society will always be involved. The TAN always has civil society, but it's not limited to that. Civil society needs to boomerang, and to boomerang, they have to get more powerful actors working with them to bring pressure to bear. Okay. So thank you so much for the chance to speak to you.
Well, thank you, Kathryn. It's been an absolute pleasure. And, what a brilliant deep dive, not only to human rights and many facets of the Global Accountability Project, but weaving together history and theory and ethics and empirical evidence. Quite the tour de force. So thank you so much again.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Imperfect Utopias or Bust, Global Governance Futures. If you liked this content, please do leave us a comment and subscribe. If you're new to the show and you want to get a list of our favorite books, other resources, listen to past shows, and to join our community, go to ucl.ac.uk/global-governance.